Paper was like gold in medieval times.
Oh, not tobacco, sugar.
That everything we thought we knew about the world might turn out to be completely wrong.
It's not just about an airplane. It's about a story. It's about a piece of history. It's about a place in time.
The project was exciting. It was the edge of the technology, leading edge stuff.
It was equivalent to us putting a man on the moon.
In one fell swoop, it was all closed out. It was the best in the world. How could it possibly shut down?
Something happened that day, it's called Black Friday.
We were told, you have to go home. This is it's a secret. You've all been sworn to secrecy and you can't take anything home.
Fortunately, a lot of people kept and snuck out secret drawings.
And they might have a drawing in their house that says top secret stamped right across it. They're wondering if the police are going to come and knock on their doors.
You were told what you needed to know to do your job, but if you didn't need to know, then better you not know about secrets.
People have been talking about it since the 70s about doing it, and nobody's ever really been able to do it.
I went over to the closed-in hangar. Oh, I opened the door, and I couldn't believe my eyes.
This is a ghost, an image of something long dead. In the 1950s, the Avro Arrow was the most advanced fighter jet in the world, the pride of a generation, the passion of 14,000 highly skilled workers trying to cut a new path through the sky. This innovative team would work together for years to create technology that had never been seen before, only to have all their hard work, hopes, and dreams utterly destroyed in one day, a day that would be remembered as Black Friday.
At the time, the big threat to North America was the huge number of Russian bombers, coming across the Arctic, the shortest route to the United States, and armed with nuclear bombs, armed with conventional bombs. They could have been either one.
But Canada, like other Western nations, didn't have aircraft that could defend against that possibility.
So they knew that in order to be able to defend the country, you had to have a supersonic aircraft. So the RCAF made a request in 1954. They laid out some standards for an airplane that they felt that they needed.
What the Royal Canadian Air Force called for was an interceptor aircraft with a crew of 2. With twin engines, it would have to fly at an altitude of 50,000 feet or 15,000 meters and break the sound barrier.
But really what it needed to do was to be able to get from their air bases, which would, for example, be North Bay, Ontario, get up over the Arctic as fast as physically possible. So you're flying, accelerate up to supersonic speeds, have a dash speed, get to the targets, launch their missiles, and then be able to get back to the base, reload and refuel, and get back out again to be able to catch a second wave if they were coming.
We were part of NORAD. With the US, we shared defense of North America. And at that time, we were flying our own CF-100s, which were a subsonic, heavy, long-range airplane. And the Americans were flying similar airplanes. And when the bomber threat became more real, then we say we need to be bigger and faster and heavier. Well, the Americans were working on airplanes, but what was flying at that time didn't have the range or didn't have the payload. So you could get speed, but no payload. So that was how come the Canadian Air Force said, we need an airplane that can do these things. It can fly at least Mach 1.5 and maneuver and have a range of 500-600 miles at supersonic speed and carry enough missiles to make sure you take down 3 or 4 bombers. The reason the Arrow was in fact built and designed and built in Canada and why they didn't go buy one was because there wasn't another airplane that would do the job.
It was a tall order at the time, especially for a company that had never built a supersonic aircraft before. Fortunately, AV Row had a team of bright young engineers. Stan Porter was one of them.
I graduated at University of BC in 1954, and I knew when I graduated I wanted to design mechanical things. So just in me, to be creative design was important. And I had heard of Avro aircraft when I was a student, but I thought that aircraft stuff, that's for hot shots. Well, I hired on, and I was doing things that were just fantastic to be able to be given assignments, have some responsibility, and these people encouraged me.
The aircraft was built by, in some ways, an international consortium because you had people coming after World War II had ended. People were coming from all over the world to work at this young company called Avro Canada. They were young engineers who may have been frustrated with their positions in England, or there was no jobs for them, and certainly through Eastern Europe too. So you had quite a mix of people working on this aircraft.
One of the challenges was building a brand new aircraft from the ground up.
There was a brand new engine, there was a brand new airframe, there was a brand new missile system, there was a brand new missile guidance system. That had never been done before, and I don't think it's ever been done since.
What this airplane represents is state-of-the-art, but it was an excellent mix of learning and observing what had been done before in aircraft and supersonic aircraft in particular, and incorporating these by clever design. So it starts off that these are bits of information, of knowledge that you can adapt.
The project took off in 1955 when the Canadian government gave the AV Row Company $260 million, which is equivalent to $2 billion today. The company had its marching orders: build 5 prototypes and subject them to rigorous testing on the ground and in the air. Then, produce 35 planes to go into service as soon as possible. The Western nations were in a tense competition with the Soviet Union to develop new military aviation technology, so the creation of the Avro Arrow was a classified government operation.
It was very secret, and you did your job, and you were told what you needed to know to do your job. But if you didn't need to know, then better you not know about secrets. I worked in doing design of test rigs. I started out with the test rigs for the hydraulic jacks that run the elevators and ailerons in the Arrow. I didn't know what the Arrow was. I knew it was a supersonic airplane, and that's all I knew. But it wasn't long, and my boss said, listen, Stan, if you're going to be designing this stuff, and by this time, of course, I'd talked to the designers of the hardware. If you're testing it, you have to know what it is you're testing. And they said, you better go and look at the airplane. So they got me the special security clearance. And I went over to the closed-in hangar where I opened the door. And I couldn't believe my eyes, really. This is this marvelous, streamlined, huge white airplane, like the frontiers of science. And I thought, my God, you know, me working on something like that, it really was mind-blowing to see this magnificent. It was a fantastic thing to see.
What he saw was an innovative design that was as simple as it was sophisticated. With powerful jet engines combined with lightweight magnesium and titanium materials to keep weight down, the Arrow was expected to be the fastest fighter in the world.
It was very advanced, but in other ways, it was very, very, just keep it simple. And, you know, you had one of the very first fly-by-wire systems in this aircraft. You had the ability to attain, you know, incredible speeds.
But this magnificence was never realized. Nearly 5 decades ago, every Avro Arrow in existence was destroyed. All the employees were laid off. No one was told why. And no one yet had a sense of the conspiracy theories and debates this event would trigger for generations to come. It was a top-secret assignment and an incredible achievement.
The project was exciting. It was the edge of the technology, leading edge stuff.
The fastest and most sophisticated fighter jet the world had ever seen, designed to go into action at the height of the Cold War.
The threat at that time was Russian bombers coming over the North Pole. And to defend our huge space in Canada, you needed an airplane that could go very fast and long distance, carry a big armament pack to shoot down these bombers.
The design team achieved their goals, but instead of putting this powerful new technology into action, the government suddenly and mysteriously pulled the plug on the Avro Arrow.
We were told, you have to go home. This is it's a secret. You've all been sworn to secrecy, and you can't take anything home, leave all your stuff there.
Since that day, the Avro Arrow has haunted Stan Porter.
I didn't realize how bitter I was, but certainly I knew I was angry, and as I said, very confused, really, that such terrible waste and things that seemed like they ought to be done weren't being done.
For years, Stan refused to have anything to do with the Arrow, and that included going to reunions with former colleagues.
Several dozen years later, when there was supposed to be a reunion of ex-Avro people, was publicized, and I thought, yeah, that'd be a good idea to go see my old buddies. But as it got closer to the date, and I was going to phone up to order some tickets, and I started to dwell on it, and I was amazed that the old anger and the bitterness boiled up in me, and 25 years later, and I just couldn't face up to the idea. I thought, no, I'm just so angry at that all being, what should have been a great future was all cut off and made to nothing.
Then, years later, Stan heard about a replica under construction at the Toronto Aerospace Museum. This time, he did not walk away as he had done so many times in the past. This time, Stan saw a chance for a little bit of redemption. He devoted himself to the recreation, a journey to fulfill a dream that ended abruptly almost 50 years ago. He would once again test his skills as an engineer while exercising the Arrow demons in his head.
I took it on as, I looked at it as a serious design challenge of, when you look at the requirements, this isn't just some little bit of sheet metal put together. This was quite a strong demand of how do you make it.
Stan joined a team of volunteers. Their goal, build a full-scale, accurate replica of Avro number 25203 from scratch.
The first things you need to look at is the size of the replica. This was a very big airplane. You can see it's 80 feet long, 50-foot wingspan. The wheels are 26 feet apart. That takes up a lot of space, and it's a big structure, and it is self-supporting. This replica weighs about 14,000 pounds, which is a pretty big force. And so this is a real structure inside here. It's not just a surface. On the other hand, being a replica, not like a real airplane, it doesn't have the real structure inside. It has structure that we could make with hand tools and without jigging of facilities.
Building the replica would require the hard work and determination of many people. Volunteers would use the Toronto Aerospace Museum as their home base.
The mandate of the museum is aviation in the Greater Toronto Area, and Avro, which is an offshoot of Victory Aircraft, is a huge piece of that aviation history. So there's most definitely a direct connection. And when we started planning the museum way back in 1997, it was always understood that one of the first projects that would be done would be a replica of the Avro Arrow.
Everybody working on it, everybody wanted it to be as good as possible. That was one of the nice things about the scheme, is all the volunteers, they didn't talk about it as the airplane, they talked about it as my airplane.
In building the replica, Stan and the others confronted a series of challenges, the greatest of which was a lack of detailed technical information about the Arrow. The original engineers were forbidden to take anything with them when they were fired, and everything to do with the Arrow was ordered destroyed. So Stan didn't have any of the drawings of the original airplane.
What we relied on was the general arrangement drawing, which showed the side view and front view, and it showed where the structural elements were in the cross sections. And there had been a book published about 10 years previous by a place called Boston Mills Press, put together by ex-Avroites some years previous, and they had collected together an amazing amount of information that had been secreted out from Avro at the time.
Ron Page was one of the authors known as the Arrowheads. They created the book The Arrow, which eventually provided the technical details required to build the replica.
And I never saw an Arrow because I was up at Dobell when all the flying was going on. I really wanted to get the Iroquois engine program recorded, and so I wasn't too interested in the Arrow until I met these other people and we saw what we had. And then the big push came from the ex-Avro people who started donating photographs and manuals, everything else they collected in their Avro days. And from that, it added to the book, and the book then became a proper technical book, which was rather amazing.
Ron was also an aeronautical engineer and pilot with the Royal Air Force. He understands the passion the Avro employees had for the Arrow project.
Well, most people were very bitter and resented the way it was cancelled and the destruction of all the material, even right down to the drawings. Fortunately, a lot of people kept and snuck out secret drawings. It was completely illegal. It was all so-called super secret, but never worried about that when the thing was so brutal.
There was actually a small gap in between the time that the aircraft was canceled and the order to destroy everything was given. And there was a lot of people also who had figured that the writing was on the wall earlier on, and they had started removing things from the plant months before the order was given.
The determination of the Avro employees preserved the classified information that should have been destroyed. As a result, Stan and the others were able to draw the technical data they needed to make the replica from Ron Page's book. But there were more roadblocks. They lacked the basic tools and building materials. And they didn't have the right skills to make it by hand. Fortunately, a number of companies came to the rescue with donated materials. Stan and the team of volunteers figured out the rest.
Well, this is a good opportunity to see the internal structure of how this airplane is put together. And when we look up in here, we can see the main torsion box of our replica crosses right over our heads here, and you can see the heavy steel structure. And if you look right beside our head is the truss work. There's two beams that are made up of lightweight steel tubing. There's a truss, and it goes from one end of the airplane to the other. And that truss is attached to the wing, and that's what all the rest of the airplane is actually holding it up. That's the structure for our replica. And this other sheet metal out here is simply very light steel framing and sheet aluminum for the shape, but the structure's there. Whereas on the real airplane, the shell is the structure.
The aircraft's trademark was its delta-shaped wing.
The first thing that's a characteristic of supersonic airplanes is the wings are awfully thin. And if you look in here, you can just see that the wing is very thin. There's only a few inches there. I'm not sure if you can see that. But it's only 3-4 inches thick at this end. At the outboard end, it's not even 1.5 inches at the hinge. It's about 1 inch.
The small team of volunteers struggled for 2 years to recreate those famous wings.
Well, supersonic airplanes typically need to have the wing thickness only 3.5% of its chord length, whereas old airplanes like this one over here, flying at a couple of 100 miles an hour, it would be typically 20%. That is, the thickness would be about a fifth of the chord length. What this meant is if you want to fly it supersonic, you have to be thin. So the consequence is you have very little material thickness in here in order to put in structure. And yet here you are trying to actuate an aileron, which has got a almost 5-foot chord from the hinge to the trailing edge.
The designers were forced to work within strict parameters to achieve their objectives.
It's got enormous aerodynamic forces on it, and you have to try to react those at the hinge, and you've only got a very, very short leverage. It's something like 20-to-1 leverage ratio here, that whatever force you got here, you got 20 times the force here.
Although the Arrow's wing design created greater drag at lower speeds, it had one major advantage. There was more room for fuel and a future weapons system that would automatically track and attack targets with missiles and rockets.
By incorporating the knowledge that had been learned, we were able to build an airplane that would be fast and carry a huge armament load. The armaments pack in this airplane was bigger than a B-29 bomber. That was a sort of a standard of a pretty big airplane in those days.
The massive size of the plane was a challenge for the designers, who had to determine how to best support the enormous weight.
Both for the model and as for the real airplane, it was a really difficult job of getting strong enough forced brackets that would carry big forces at each end, and there's a very narrow triangle of the supports are very close together, so there's enormous forces in this replica going into each of these attachment points. So it's a demanding piece of structural design.
Construction of the replica presented some different challenges for its designers than the original plane. Because it would be a display piece, the wings faced a threat that the real Arrow didn't.
I decided it would be very important to make sure that these were strong enough to carry, okay? So I decided we had to be able to have a 200-pound man hang off of them, and if we had to have enough strength to do that on top of its own weight. That's the reality of a replica.
Workers on the original Arrow had the benefit of the latest technology. For the first time, the tools and equipment for the prototypes would be the same equipment used to build the production aircraft. This innovative manufacturing process would save money by eliminating the practice of building prototypes by hand. It would also let production on the final version of the aircraft begin right away. On October 4th of 1957, the first prototype was unveiled to the public. Unfortunately for the thousands of people working on the aircraft, the Arrow was upstaged by a revolutionary Soviet technology, one that would have huge implications on the future of the Arrow. On the very same day, the USSR launched Sputnik, the world's first satellite. The Soviets now had the edge in space, and the race was on for the West to catch up. Meanwhile, the Arrow was plagued by mechanical problems. Among them, issues with the landing gear.
It was designed by a lot of young and up-and-coming engineers who were, had different ideas. I think today we would probably call it thinking out of the box. And that's what they were doing.
Every aircraft I've flown has had flaws, so don't get too excited about that subject. For example, the Tiger Moth, the simplest aircraft you could have in England, had no brakes. It relied on the tail skid.
They saw a problem, everybody said that it couldn't be done, and they said, well, let's sit back and have a look. And they sat back and they had their look, and they basically did it.
The significant thing about being a thin wing is that it is very difficult to stow this undercarriage. The undercarriage has to be man-sized. In the real airplane, it was holding up 60,000 pounds. When an airplane lands, there's double that force applied to the wheel. So it's a very sturdy structure carrying a large load, and yet it has to stow into a very narrow space. And it's not just a thin space, but it's a constrained space. Thing you have to notice is that the undercarriage has to stow by going forward. So this undercarriage also had to twist as it closed up. So It was a very complex structure, and all those mechanical parts had to be stowed.
Besides the main undercarriage, there were other design challenges that forced the engineers to think creatively.
So I wanted to show you the nose undercarriage. It's different animal, and it's dear to my heart because I worked on the nose undercarriage when I first worked at Avro. I was a young graduate. I designed a test rig that would function test it, so it's an old friend. The function of any undercarriage is that you've got a very huge load concentrated in a small point. This leg, normally if the airplane's just standing still, carries about 10% of the airplane's weight. We have to carry this concentrated load, and it has to go into these little brackets that are attached into the fuselage. Now, in the replica, we don't have real structure inside. We have a skeleton of a truss made of thin tube welded together, which is fine for transmitting general loads, but to get concentrated loads, there was a real challenge to design the structure that would carry these concentrated loads and distribute them into the skeleton structure.
Despite the many obstacles, the structure of the Arrow replica had been successfully recreated. Stan Porter must have had a sense of reliving the past working through the challenges of this project. At the same point in the creation of the original Arrow, the design team had completed their development and a prototype was ready for its first flight attempt. The expectations for the Arrow were sky high. The team hoped their revolutionary fighter was finally ready to demonstrate its capabilities to the world. At the height of the Cold War, Western powers were looking for cutting-edge technology to defend against a possible Soviet attack. The challenge was issued to develop a supersonic interceptor aircraft that could meet Soviet bombers over the Arctic before they reached the highly populated regions of North America. The fastest, most state-of-the-art fighter jet was about to be unveiled, but it had yet to be tested. Everyone expected the cutting-edge aircraft to put Canada on the aviation map. By 1958, 5 prototypes had rolled out of Avro Arrow factory near Toronto. The company had spent millions developing their new fighter jet, and still the aircraft had never flown. It was now time for the Arrow to prove its worth, with the first in a series of test flights in the spring of 1958. The Arrow's speed was expected to be impressive. Aside from some minor complications, the Arrow performed better than expected. It flew at 50,000 feet, reaching a top speed of just under Mach 2. However, the next generation of the Avro aircraft was almost ready. It would be fitted with new Canadian-made Iroquois jet engines, and it was expected to break the world record for speed.
There were problems. I don't think there's ever been an aircraft that was built that didn't have problems on its first flight. And they were in the process of working out a lot of those issues. And certainly in the second models and the third models that were on the drawing boards, a lot of these things would have been worked out and probably would have ended up a very efficient aircraft. And we would probably be flying some sort of a derivative of the Arrow today.
Every attempt had been made, right down to the smallest detail, to engineer the fastest plane possible.
The real airplane had this, it was famous for this unique configuration of intake. And the reason is because at high speed you build up a boundary layer of dead air. And so this had this blade a few inches away from the fuselage, which sliced off the dead air and got nice fresh air into the intake. And secondly, it had these perforations that you see just in front of the intake. That was in addition to ensure that only really good live air got into the engine intakes. There was a vacuum applied through those perforations. And the space in between You'll notice there's a cavity in there between the upper and lower surfaces. That space was, they sucked the air off there, went into an air conditioning system for the cockpit cooling. So this configuration is unique, and that's a difficult thing to model.
Original thinking helped the engineers fulfill the Arrow's performance requirements. The resulting design innovations cemented the Interceptor's place in history as an aviation masterpiece.
It is unique. There's only one other airplane that is even remotely similar. But the Arrow is unique in, first off, its windshield having two triangles forming an arch that was necessary to keep the profile down for minimum drag. And then it's closed by these twin clamshell doors. You can see they're hinged down along the top of the fuselage. And when they're closed by these rather heavy-duty latches over the top of the head. There's a lever there that the pilot had to reach up and pull. And above them was a seal, which meant that the pilot actually was down quite a bit further than you would have expected for the shape of the airplane. But as you can see, looking even from here, he didn't have a great view looking forward. He saw mostly the nose of the airplane. And this airplane, like most Deltas, landed with its nose way up in the air, about 30 degrees. And consequently, you really had to look out the side window. It's like driving your car looking at the curb. The other thing that was unique about this profile, we have a standard, it was a Martin Baker Mark V ejection seat that the pilot sat in. And literally there's a large rocket under the seat where if the pilot had to go in an emergency, he would open the clamshells, fire this rocket and shoot straight back up. One of the other unique things is I remember just seeing a profile that because of the slope at which he comes up, you look at where his feet would be on the rudders. They'd be tucked up underneath the dash, and the first thing that happened was some cables on his boots pulled his feet back tight. And when he ejected his toes, there was a profile I saw drawn. His toes just nicely missed the windshield. This is a very good replica of the original cockpit. The stick and the instruments are very much like what the original instruments were. Of course, there's standard things like altimeter and airspeed and some engine controls, which told you about the speed of the engine and the temperatures and things like that.
The Arrow's pilot would not have flown the aircraft alone. The plane was built for a crew of 2.
Well, he wasn't a co-pilot. He was a navigator, and his other job was to actually run the armaments if there was which his job was, of course, to shoot down Russian bombers. And he ran the armament system. His station was directly behind the pilot in a similar clamshell canopy, which hinged at the top in the same way, but he had no windows to speak of, just the small little squares so he could barely see out. The idea was, frankly, he was supposed to be looking at electronic instruments, radar screens to do his job anyhow. And you really don't need much light to look at those screens. So that was a controversy, by the way. You know, the Air Force, some of the pilots were most unhappy, but some of their higher-ups thought it was a good idea, so that's the way it got built.
Although the Avro Arrow was researched, tested, and built to exacting specifications, there were signs that the secret project of the Avro company might never get off the ground.
Don't forget, it wasn't just an airplane. It was a capability, a team, a manufacturing facility, research facilities. It was a whole enterprise that had been developed and grown, and it takes money, and it was a big enterprise, and the costs were going. So there had been rumblings, but frankly, I distinctly remember talking to colleagues and to other people. They wouldn't possibly cancel the airplane, and by that time 5 of them were flying, and every day they made some other gain in performance that was published. We've done this, making world records all the time, and we all honestly believe they can't possibly cancel the airplane. It's too good.
The Arrow team could boast that it had created the greatest fighter interceptor the world had ever seen. But not only was it very expensive to manufacture, with the Soviet launch of Sputnik, the Western world had been forced to reconsider its military defense strategy. The playing field had changed forever and, as impressive as it was, the Arrow had to clearly be the right response to any Soviet threat. At the height of its achievements, it was possible the Arrow was on the brink of extinction. On October 4th, 1957, the first prototype of the Avro Arrow was unveiled. It was the fastest, most sophisticated fighter interceptor ever developed, utilizing technology and engineering design far ahead of its time. It was meant to be a key part of the Western defense strategy against any possible Soviet attacks on North America. Ironically, on the very same day the Arrow was introduced, the USSR launched Sputnik, the world's first satellite. It was the beginning of a brand new era and the birth of the global space race. The team that designed, built, and successfully tested the Arrow still believed that their supersonic fighter could play an important role in defending North American soil. That dream ended on the 20th of February, 1959. Canadian Prime Minister John Diefenbaker rose in the House of Commons to make an announcement that shocked the nation. Production of the Arrow and its engines would end immediately.
So when the news finally came, we were all busy working away I was doing studies on future uses. And the news came and we're all busy at work. In the loudspeaker has the voice of the president and says, "We've been canceled, put down your pencils and go home."
October 20th, 1959 is known as Black Friday, the day the Arrow died. No explanation was offered. To this day, it's a mystery why it happened, why the Canadian government canceled the most advanced aircraft in the world suddenly and without warning.
There really was disbelief. They couldn't really possibly cancel, but we were told, you have to go home. This is it's a secret. You've all been sworn to secrecy and you can't take anything home, leave all your stuff there.
Officially, the project was too expensive. It was millions of dollars over budget, and the new Prime Minister had campaigned against government waste.
The country was entering into a bit of a recession at the time. The Army and the Navy were actually getting upset because all the funds were going to the Air Force and the Air Force weapons system, and why can't we get any new equipment?
But the age of the intercontinental ballistic missile had also dawned with the launch of Sputnik. As a result, many military experts argued that airplanes like the Arrow, designed to intercept bombers, were now obsolete.
The Air Force wanted a very advanced weapon system and guidance system, which wasn't available in Canada, and the Americans hadn't got it fully developed even in America. So when the Air Force was asked, what do you do about the Arrow? They said, we've got an aircraft, and we've got an engine, we've got no weapon system, so the aircraft's no use to us. And the memo stating that, and of course that just put the nail in the coffin. Plus, there was a terrible personality problem between Avro and the Diefenbaker government, and we had a very weak defense minister as well. And Diefenbaker was a one-man cabinet. That's the best way I can explain it.
However, there's another more controversial theory. Some blame the United States for intervening to end the Arrow program to keep Canada from holding the keys to superior military technology. Instead of building its own aircraft, Canada was told it could buy all the planes it required from the US.
There's no doubt about it, the project was expensive. I'm quite sure that other aviation companies in North America and in Britain were probably afraid of it for the simple fact that, here's another product on the market that's really good. It's going to chew up some of our market share. Do we want this airplane to come to fruition? I don't think so.
A lot of people believe that the Americans helped cancellation. It's just the opposite fact. They helped the Arrow program all the way through with supersonic wind tunnel data time, which was very scarce in those days. and even offered to buy a squadron of Arrows, but the Canadian government said, don't ask us officially.
There's an old saying in aviation that says, there's never one thing. If an airplane crashes, it's not because of just one thing. It's always a number of things working at the same time.
Officials ordered the Arrow, its engines, along with the tools and materials used to build it, scrapped.
The part about it, the promising future suddenly being cut off, unfinished business, promises are not kept, something like that. But it wasn't just that the airplane was canceled, but just all that such terrible waste, a really shocking waste was troubling them. There was always that feeling maybe we could make something out of it.
Most people were deeply sorry because we had such an enjoyable time at that point, leading the world in aeronautics and engine development, and to suddenly have it come crashing down in one day. So a lot of people were very bitter.
I watched the airplanes actually being cut up and chopped up, and that certainly put finality to, you know, we're not going to build Arrows anymore. That's for sure, because they chopped everything up, and there was this terrible scene that really was a very, very traumatic scene to see guys up actually on the wing. I can remember watching a guy, and there was tears running down his face as he was running a blowtorch through the front joint, and the wing dropped off. And well, it's a very traumatic thing. This is not just a piece of metal that's being chopped up, but it was a creature that had it was the product of many people's hard work.
Well, it's still not clear as to who gave the order, or how it happened, but basically everything was cut up and destroyed. The 5 airplanes that were out on the tarmac, they took a blowtorch to, and the other aircraft that were on the assembly line were reportedly to be disassembled piece by piece. The 5 aircraft out on the tarmac, that was referred to as death row. And that's one of the things that gave rise to that whole, the myth of the missing Arrow, because on one day somebody flew over the airport and took a picture of what they called death row, and there was only 4 planes there. So everybody said, well, one of them got away. Well, really what had happened was one of them had been in the repair shop already, and there was a landing gear problem with it. So that aircraft was dragged out the next day, and if you would have gone back a couple of days later and take the same picture, all 5 aircraft were there. So, but yeah, everything was cut up, hauled out in barges to a scrap company in Hamilton area. Some people say, you know, it was all melted down. There's many, many stories.
The myth about the missing Arrow is completely wrong. There is no such thing. All Arrows were accounted for and scrapped.
The impact of the cancellation was immediate. 14,000 people lost their jobs right away. Then thousands more in related supporting industries.
When they shut down the Arrow, they talk about the 14,000 people who were out of jobs right away. But the estimate is that after 2 years, probably about 50,000 people lost their jobs because they had been working for subcontractors, and they tried to make a go out of it when the project was canceled, but just it was not possible to make it work. A lot of people walked away from their mortgages, walked away from cars, houses were left empty, cars left in the driveways. People just packed up and went back to where they came from to start again.
A number of former Avro workers went to NASA, where they became lead engineers and program managers involved in the agency's manned space programs. The most famous of all, the Apollo mission. In a strange twist of fate, Avro engineers would play a crucial role in another aerospace milestone, the first man on the moon.
Literally, a lot of the American aerospace companies were at the doors, at the gates, waiting for these guys to come out of the plant, and were literally hiring them on the spot.
Stan stayed in Canada, where he continued to work as an aerospace engineer. but he didn't have anything to do with the legendary plane.
You know, your future, it had been all laid out. I mean, for me, as I said, I'm working at a great job with a great company that had done things. It was suddenly chopped off, was disbelief, you know, an empty thing. Well, my God, what do I do now?
In the years after the Arrow program ended, and with every trace of the aircraft ordered destroyed, the legendary airplane was in serious danger of becoming nothing more than a fading memory. Yet the mystique and fascination surrounding the Arrow grew with time. Stories continue to circulate about the incredible accomplishments of the aircraft, and conspiracy theories about its end flourish to this day. For the general public, it's all been shrouded in a great deal of mystery. So much so that people that have stumbled upon artifacts from the Arrow's past feel concerned that they might be in breach of national security.
Everybody's always nervous about having this top secret information, and they might have a drawing in their house that says top secret stamped right across it. And we've actually had instances where we've received calls from people who have found drawings and they really don't know what to do with them, and they're wondering if the police are going to come and knock on their doors. One of the best ones was a guy who called me from north of Toronto here and said they'd bought a house, and there was a big couch in the basement, and they wanted to get rid of the couch and couldn't get it out the door, so they cut it up. And inside were all the plans of the Avro Arrow. Somebody had actually taken them and hidden them away because they thought that the RCMP might come after them or something. But they felt it was important enough that they wanted to keep these plans.
Like so many Avro employees, Stan had a tough time coming to terms with the fact that his dream job on the Arrow abruptly ended. The replica helped him work it through. It was his chance to right a terrible wrong, to bring back at least an image of one of the greatest achievements in the life of a nation and the life of this engineer. The team of volunteers was determined to make sure this part of the story did not end in tragedy.
The first time we opened the hangar doors and backed it out to take it over to the paint shop, and it was a moment where really we had tears in our eyes.
The Arrow has a much broader appeal. It's not just about an airplane. It's about a story. It's about a piece of history. It's about a place in time. So the majority of people that actually come through to see the Arrow don't really know what it looked like.
On October 4th, 2006, the replica was unveiled. It came nearly 8 years after work on the replica began, and 49 years after the original was first revealed to the public.
You've got people who come into the museum and then they walk around the corner and there's just, this big hulking piece of metal standing in front of them. Usually quite often, the first thing is, I can't believe it's that big. It's usually the first thing that comes out of their mouths. It's really, really nice to see to see 3 generations walk through the door where you got Granddad, his son, and his grandson, and they're able to sit there and then talk about the aircraft and say, well, that's the section that I worked on, or this is what I did.
This new Arrow is more than 6 tons of fiberglass, aluminum, and steel, with many of the intricate details of the real plane. Even though it's a replica, many consider it a work of art, a critical piece in the Avro Arrow story that finally brings an aviation legend to life.
A lot of people who worked on it and who worked on the original one, yeah, it was a fulfillment of a dream. They, they felt that they were done wrong by the government, and they hated to see the story die. And I think what they just hated the most was that everything was cut up. So at least if an aircraft had been saved, they could have taken their grandchildren and said, well, I worked on this. I did this. This was a really high point in my life. I felt like $1 million when I worked at this company. It's nice to see them feeling so good about it and being able to tell their grandchildren about it.
In aviation circles, the Avro Arrow is revered as one of Canada's greatest technological achievements. The Toronto Aerospace Museum decided to build a full-size replica of the Arrow in 1998. The production team was made up of all volunteer labor. The commemorative full-scale model is now complete and is on permanent display at the museum.
Certainly nowadays, anybody who is an aviation historian, an aviation, or a serious military aviation buff, they pretty much know the story of the Arrow. When we did the rollout, we got coverage in a German paper, in a German magazine, in an Italian magazine. Certainly the newsletter of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, you know, wanted pictures of it. So certainly there's it's fairly wide knowledge. You know, there is it's certainly not just Canadian centric. There's anybody who's anybody in aviation knows the story of the Arrow.
People have to see and understand that we did a very great thing in building this airplane in the first place.
It was equivalent to us putting a man on the moon. The Arrow itself was a very unique aircraft at the time. First fly-by-wire, in the true sense of the word, with vacuum tube computers before microchips.
The general public seems to be unconcerned, just not aware, and they need to be. And that was a large reason why Mr. Diefenbaker's government was able to cancel in the first place. There wasn't a big outcry because most people really didn't know enough about it and didn't really understand. The government didn't understand, and the general public just weren't informed. And if that message gets across, then it's served a great purpose.
Accomplishing the goal of bringing the Arrow back to life and putting it on display for the next generation of Canadians has helped heal the wounds the sudden cancellation of the original Arrow left behind in its wake.
Something happened that day called Black Friday, the day that Canada lost its aviation industry. So when disasters like that occur, they stay in memory and are passed on for many generations, probably. I'm sure the history books 50 years from now still refer to the Arrow.
It sounds maybe a bit corny, but this was closure. I finally was able to close out that missing feeling that had been in my life for almost 50 years now. So it was more than just building something for other people to see. I built this for me, and I got an enormous satisfaction and got very emotional when we rolled that out the first time. To see it actually on its own wheels running down the runway, that was a marvelous feeling, almost as good as seeing it the first time.